In the early hours of April 10th, 1940, Captain Bernard Warburton Lee steered his 5 destroyers into a Norwegian passage barely wide enough to maneuver in. His target was the Arctic port, funneling Swedish iron into Hitler's war machine. His window was closing. A local pilot station had handed him the intel he desperately needed: the unsuspecting German warships at anchor and a snowstorm for cover. 5 against 6, and no room to hide. Reckless, yes, but Warburton Lee had run the numbers. Surprise would be his 6th ship. That was enough for an ambush. But in the cold, dark waters of Norway, he wasn't the only one lurking. If you want to understand why the Ofot fjord exploded with violence in April 1940, you first need to understand just how much Narvik mattered. Throughout the winter months, the Baltic Sea froze solid, effectively trapping the vast reserves of high-grade Swedish iron ore mined in Kiruna and Gällivare. Narvik, situated hundreds of miles north of the Arctic Circle, featured an ice-free harbor warmed by the North Atlantic Drift, making it the only viable winter shipment point for the critical ore. This iron was the foundational resource of the Third Reich's armaments industry. Without a continuous, uninterrupted supply, the production of German tanks, artillery, and munitions would grind to a halt within months. Winston Churchill, serving as First Lord of the Admiralty and fully recognizing the strategic vulnerability, tirelessly advocated for mining the Norwegian coastal waters, the so-called leads, to force German ore transports out into the open sea, where the Royal Navy could intercept them. But Allied ambitions extended far beyond naval mines. Frustrated by Norway's strict insistence on neutrality and its outright refusal to cooperate with the Allies or halt the flow of iron to the Reich, the British and French high commands formulated Plan R4. This was a bold operation to land Allied expeditionary forces, occupy Narvik, and physically sever the rail links to the Swedish mines, with or without Norwegian consent. Hitler, however, was well aware of these looming threats and beat them to the punch, launching Operation Visagopum just as the Allied forces were preparing to move. He initiated a synchronized invasion of Denmark and Norway to preempt the British, secure the ports, and safeguard his vital supply lines. It was a desperate, high-stakes race for the Iron Prize. The naval component of Visagopum represented arguably the most audacious and high-risk amphibious assault in modern naval history. To capture Narvik, the Kriegsmarine assembled Group 1, a task force consisting of 10 modern Type 1934 and Type 1936 destroyers under the command of Commodore Friedrich Bonte. The ships were dangerously overloaded, carrying 2,000 elite mountain troops, or Gebirgsjäger of the 139th Mountain Infantry, under the command of General Edward Dietl. Sailing these unarmored top-heavy destroyers directly through waters historically dominated by the Royal Navy Home Fleet was a monumental strategic gamble, banking entirely on the elements of unprecedented speed and absolute surprise. The crossing of the North Sea rapidly devolved into a terrifying ordeal. As Group 1 departed Bremerhaven on April 6th and pushed northward, they were swallowed by an apocalyptic Arctic gale. The German destroyers were violently battered by mountainous waves, suffering immediate structural and mechanical damage. Aboard the destroyer Paul Jacobi, the rolling was so severe that water flooded the port boiler intakes, temporarily shutting down the engine and washing 5 sailors overboard to their deaths. Across the flotilla, 10 men and significant quantities of vital military equipment were swept into the freezing abyss. The ships were forced to reduce speed from 35 knots down to 27, simply to survive the sea state. The critical element of surprise was almost permanently shattered on the morning of April 8th. The British destroyer HMS Glowworm, which had separated from the battlecruiser HMS Renown to search for a man lost overboard, stumbled directly into the path of the German heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, which was screening the invasion forces. Despite being massively outgunned and enduring devastating 8-inch shell fire, Glowworm fought a desperate holding action. In a final act of defiance, the burning British destroyer rammed the Hipper at full speed, tearing a massive 30-meter gash in the cruiser's armored hull before sinking. The violent encounter served as a dire warning to the Admiralty that major German fleet units were at sea. But under the blinding cover of the screaming storm, Bonte's destroyer flotilla slipped past the heavy units of the Royal Navy and vanished into the darkness, making their final approach toward the Vestfjord. In the early freezing hours of April 9th, Commodore Bonta's battered flotilla navigated the treacherous entry into the Vestfjord, their approach obscured by heavy mist and a driving snowstorm. Understanding that an overt assault might trigger the coastal defenses before the troops could land, the Germans employed a cunning ruse. They used English-language naval signals and disguised their initial approach, posing as British vessels to sow maximum confusion among the scattered Norwegian patrol boats. This Trojan horse tactic allowed them to penetrate deep into the Ofotfjord unchallenged, capturing the Norwegian patrol vessels Senja, Michaelsars, and Kelt without firing a shot, until they reached the immediate approaches to Narvik harbor. Standing in their way were the aging Norwegian coastal defense ship, or Panserskip, HNOMS Eidsvold in Norge. Built 40 years earlier, at the end of the 19th century, these vessels were slow and antiquated, but their 8.2-inch Krupp guns had more than enough firepower to obliterate the thinly armored German destroyers if they could acquire their targets. At approximately 4:15 a.m., the Eidsvold pierced the snow squall and intercepted the German flagship, Wilhelm Heidkamp. Captain Odd Isaacson Willich of the Eidsvold ordered an Aldous lamp signal sent, and when the Germans failed to respond properly, he fired a warning shot across the German bow and hoisted a two-flag signal demanding the destroyer halt. Under strict orders to seize the port peacefully, if at all possible, Commander Bonta halted the Heidkamp and dispatched a small launch carrying Korvettenkaptein Gerlach to negotiate. Gerlach boarded the Eidsvold and brazenly demanded that the Norwegians surrender their vessels to the German armed forces, claiming they had arrived as friends to protect Norway from British aggression. Captain Willich flatly refused the ultimatum. Requesting time, he radioed his superior, Captain Per Askum, aboard the Norge, deeper inside the harbor, to report the German demands. Askum's response was absolute and immediate. Willich was to open fire. Willich turned to the German emissary and stated, quote, "I am attacking." As Gerlach hastily departed the ship and fired a red flare into the sky to indicate Norwegian resistance, Willich shouted to his crew, quote, "Man the guns. We're going to fight, boys." The engagement that followed was an execution. Before the heavy Norwegian guns could effectively track their targets in the swirling snow, the Wilhelm Heidkamp, having already positioned herself 700 meters off the port side, preemptively unleashed a spread of 4 torpedoes. At such close range, evasion was impossible. The torpedoes slammed into the Eidsvold. One detonated directly beneath the primary magazine, triggering a catastrophic secondary explosion. The ancient warship was blown completely in half, slipping beneath the freezing waters in less than 15 seconds, with the propellers still turning. The horrific blast took 175 Norwegian sailors to their graves. Only 6 men survived the freezing water. Moments later, the Norge opened fire from inside the harbor, but her inexperienced gunners failed to score any hits in the poor visibility. The German destroyer Baron von Arnim retaliated with a devastating torpedo salvo of its own, sending Norge and 101 of her crew to the bottom of the fjord. With the naval defenders annihilated in a brutal, one-sided action that lasted mere minutes, the German destroyers glided to the steamship piers. General Dietl's exhausted Gebirgsjäger rapidly disembarked and seized the town, aided by the pro-Nazi Norwegian garrison commander, Colonel Konrad Sundlo, who surrendered the land forces without firing a shot. The audacious invasion appeared to have been a flawless tactical success. While the ground assault was an unmitigated triumph, a fatal logistical flaw in the planning of Operation Weserübung was rapidly materializing, threatening to turn the victory into a total disaster. The German operational timetable relied entirely on the immediate refueling of the 10 destroyers so they could return to the safety of the open ocean and German territorial waters before the Royal Navy could react to the invasion. This precise exfiltration plan hinged on 2 pre-positioned naval tankers, the Kattegat and the Jan Willem, which was supposed to be waiting in Narvik. The critical failure occurred hundreds of miles to the south. The Kattegat, carrying half the necessary fuel oil for Group 1, was intercepted on the evening of April 9th in the Glomfjord by the tiny Norwegian fishery protection vessel HNOMS Nordkapp. Armed with only a single 47mm gun, the Nordkapp fired into the tanker's waterline, forcing the German crew to scuttle the vessel to prevent its capture. This catastrophic logistical loss left Commodore Bonta completely dependent on the Jan Willem, a converted former whale factory ship that had arrived from the Soviet port of Murmansk just prior to the invasion. As the massive German destroyers clustered around the Jan Willem in Narvik harbor, a grim operational reality set in. The converted whaling ship was equipped with inferior pumping equipment and suffered from frozen hoses due to the extreme Arctic temperatures. Consequently, the Naval could only refuel 2 destroyers simultaneously, and the agonizingly slow transfer rate meant the process required 7 to 8 hours per pair of ships. Bunta quickly realized the severity of his predicament. His modern lethal warships were practically immobilized, their fuel bunkers bone dry after the harrowing high-speed gale crossing. Unable to escape on the evening of April 9th as planned, Bunta was forced to scatter his destroyers across the harbor and into the branching arms of the Fjord and Belangen Bay. This decision was made to mitigate the risk of a concentrated British air attack, but it unwittingly dispersed his concentrated firepower. The hunters were now sitting ducks, shackled to a slow tanker in a narrow, dead-end fjord. Outside the Vestfjord, the jaws of the British trap were closing. The British 2nd Destroyer Flotilla, commanded by Captain Bernard Warburton Lee, arrived off the coast on the afternoon of April 9th. Warburton Lee anchored near the Tranøy pilot station and sent officers ashore to gather intelligence. The local Norwegian pilots delivered chilling news. The Germans had not sent a single ship, as the Admiralty in London had suggested, but at least 6 massive destroyers and a U-boat had passed into the fjord, and the channel was rumored to be heavily mined. Warburton Lee relayed this terrifying discrepancy back to the Admiralty. Their response was characteristically detached, stating only he could know if it was wise to attack, and whatever decision he made would have their full support. Faced with a numerically superior enemy force, occupying treacherous, confined waters, Warburton Lee made a decision that would posthumously win him the first Victoria Cross of the Second World War. He would not wait for Admiral Whitworth's heavy reinforcements. He signaled his intent to attack at dawn on the high tide, calculating that the elevated water level would carry his shallow draft destroyers safely over any submerged minefields. As he finalized his battle plan, he was completely unaware that he was sailing into the teeth of 10, not 6 German destroyers. At 4:30 a.m. on the morning of April 10th, the British 2nd Destroyer Flotilla, comprising HMS Hardy, Hunter, Havoc, Hotspur, and Hostel, crept into the Fjord. The meteorological conditions were atrocious, featuring a heavy snowstorm that severely restricted visibility. The British ships were forced to rely on dim stern lights to maintain their line-ahead formation as they navigated the treacherous, rocky channel blindly. This blinding mist, however, proved to be a profound technical blessing. The weather shielded the British approach, allowing them to slip past the German U-boat pickets stationed in the outer fjord entirely undetected, and the sole German surface picket ship, Dieter von Roeder, had inexplicably left its patrol station to refuel just moments prior. As Warburton Lee's flagship, HMS Hardy, slid silently into Narvik harbor, the element of surprise was absolute. The German forces were caught completely off guard. Their crews were exhausted from the invasion, and many were still sleeping in their bunks. Through the swirling snow, the massive silhouettes of German destroyers materialized alongside the Jan Willem and the surrounding commercial piers. Hardy immediately raised her battle ensigns and unleashed a spread of torpedoes. The first torpedo missed its military target, striking a merchant vessel, but the second found its mark with devastating precision. It slammed directly into the aft magazine of the German flagship Wilhelm Heidkamp. The resulting detonation was cataclysmic. A tremendous explosion blew the stern completely off the ship, hurling her 3 aft 5-inch guns into the freezing water and killing 81 men instantly, including Commodore Friedrich Bunta, whose command was abruptly and violently terminated. Seconds later, HMS Hunter and Havoc poured their fire into the harbor, unleashing their own torpedo salvos. 2 torpedoes ripped into the German destroyer Anton Schmidt. The structural integrity of the vessel failed catastrophically under the double impact. She broke completely in half, with her forward section rolling over and becoming hopelessly entangled with the upper works of the neighboring Hermann Kunne, further immobilizing the German response. The harbor quickly devolved into a chaotic, cinematic inferno of burning oil, screaming steel, and sinking vessels. With the primary German warships crippled or scrambling to return fire, the British 4.7-inch guns tore mercilessly into the docked merchantmen, many of which were carrying iron ore or logistical supplies for the German invasion force. In this initial, furious bombardment, the British effectively created a turkey shoot, sinking or disabling 11 merchant ships in a matter of minutes. as Hardy and her consorts circled the harbor for a second pass, devastating everything in their path and trading salvos with shore batteries. It appeared that the Royal Navy had pulled off a miraculous total victory. Warburton Lee, believing he'd successfully neutralized the reported force of 6 destroyers, ordered his flotilla to withdraw and assess the damage, confident that his gamble had paid off. The illusion of a flawless British victory was violently shattered the moment the flotilla turned its prows toward the open sea. As Warburton Lee's ships steamed westward out of the harbor, assuming the engagement was concluded, 3 fresh, fully armed German destroyers, Wolfgang Zenker, Erich Kullner, and Erich Giese, abruptly materialized from the blinding mist of the Fjord to the north. These vessels, under the command of Commander Erich Bay, had been hiding in the sidearm of the fjord and were entirely unengaged. Before the British could fully pivot their turrets to engage this new threat, 2 more German destroyers, Georg Thiele and Baron von Arnim, emerged from Balanger Bay to the south. The trap had snapped shut. The 5 British H-class destroyers, already low on ammunition and having expended their torpedoes during the harbor raid, suddenly found themselves caught in a devastating crossfire against 5 heavier German warships. A frantic, close-range gunnery duel ensued at speeds exceeding 30 knots. The Georg Thiele focused her concentrated 5-inch gunfire on the British van, registering multiple heavy hits on the bridge and forward superstructure of HMS Hardy. The bridge was rapidly reduced to twisted, burning metal. Captain Warburton Lee was mortally wounded, alongside the majority of his bridge staff. In his dying moments, as his ship lost steering and plummeted uncontrollably toward the rocky shore, Warburton Lee ordered his final, immortal signal, hoisted to the yardarm, quote, "Continue to engage the enemy." Paymaster Lieutenant Geoffrey Stanning, the sole surviving officer on the bridge, attempted to ram a German destroyer, but ultimately beached the burning Hardy to save the surviving crew, who were forced to abandon ship into the freezing surf under relentless machine gun fire from the shore. The disaster rapidly compounded for the British. HMS Hunter suffered a catastrophic hit to her engine room, instantly ending the engineering crew and leaving her dead in the water, engulfed in flames and losing speed. Moments later, HMS Hotspur, her own steering controls severed by German fire, plowed uncontrollably into the side of the burning Hunter. The 2 British destroyers were locked together under intense German bombardment. When Hotspur finally managed to reverse engines and tear herself free, the Hunter immediately capsized and sank, taking 107 men down with her. The surviving British ships, Havoc, Hostel, and the crippled Hotspur, fought a desperate rearguard action, battering the Georg Thiele with several critical hits that destroyed a gun and a boiler room, forcing the Germans to break off their pursuit. Low on fuel and ammunition themselves, the German destroyers retreated back up the fjord. As the battered British remnants limped toward the open sea, they encountered a massive German merchant vessel entering the fjord. It was the Rauenfels, the desperately needed German supply ship loaded with reserve artillery ammunition, torpedoes, and explosives for the flotilla. Without hesitation, HMS Havoc opened fire. The Rauenfels detonated with a catastrophic roar, sending a column of fire and debris over 1,000 feet into the sky. The explosion vaporized the ship, ensuring that the German destroyers left behind in Narvik would have no means to replenish their exhausted magazines. The first battle of Narvik was over. Both flotilla commanders, Bunte and Warburton Lee, were gone. The British had been severely bloodied, but by destroying the ammunition ship, they'd fundamentally crippled the German naval position. Immediately after the April 10th engagement, a dreadful, tense interlude settled over the Fjord. Inside Narvik, the operational situation for the surviving German forces was catastrophic. Command had passed to Commander Erich Bay, who inherited a decimated and highly vulnerable flotilla. Of his remaining 8 destroyers, several were heavily damaged, and all were suffering from critical shortages of fuel and ammunition due to the spectacular destruction of the Rauenfels. Naval Command West in Germany, recognizing the extreme peril of the situation, ordered Bay to execute an immediate breakout to the open sea. On the evening of April 10th, Bay took the only 2 operationally ready ships, Wolfgang Zenker and Erich Giese, and slipped quietly down the fjord under the cover of darkness. However, as they approached the Trinoi lighthouse near the fjord's exit, the horizon revealed the unmistakable silhouettes of a superior British blocking force, including the light cruiser HMS Penelope and the destroyer HMS Bedouin. realizing that engaging fully stocked British cruisers on the open sea without the cover of heavy fog was suicidal, they abandoned the breakout attempt and retreated back into the trap of Narvik. Over the next 48 hours, Bay's demeanor bordered on defeatist. He sent pessimistic signals back to Germany, declaring a breakout impossible, while his ships suffered further damage, grounding themselves on submerged rocks during frantic harbor maneuvers in the narrow confines. For the British, the mood was one of cold, calculated vengeance. The loss of HMS Hardy and Hunter, and the death of Warburton Lee, stung the Royal Navy deeply. They were no longer willing to rely on small destroyer flotillas to finish the job or risk another ambush. Admiral Sir Charles Forbes, Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet, resolved to apply overwhelming and disproportionate force to eradicate the German presence. Vice Admiral William Whitworth transferred his flag to HMS Warspit, a 32,000-ton Queen Elizabeth-class super-dreadnought battleship, and a revered veteran of the Battle of Jutland. Warspit was armed with 8 massive 15-inch naval guns, weapons designed to hurl 1-ton armor-piercing shells across open oceans to shatter other capital ships. Sending a capital ship of this magnitude into a narrow, uncharted fjord known to harbor U-boats and potential minefields was a monumental tactical risk. It was considered severe overkill by traditional naval doctrine. But it was not merely a tactical decision. It was a psychological statement. The Royal Navy was coming to erase the Kriegsmarine from the Arctic, leveraging pure, unadulterated firepower to ensure complete annihilation. April 13th dawned with the terrifyingly majestic sight of HMS Warspit leading a vanguard of 9 modern destroyers, including the heavily armed tribal-class Bedouin, Cossack, Eskimo, and Punjabi, up the Ofot Fjord in broad daylight. The Second Battle of Narvik was underway, and this time, the British discarded the element of surprise entirely in favor of brute, overwhelming force. Before the surface fleets even engaged, Warspit demonstrated the rapidly evolving nature of naval warfare. She catapulted her float-equipped Fairey Swordfish reconnaissance aircraft into the air to scout ahead of the task force. Patrolling ahead of the battleship, the Swordfish, piloted by Petty Officer Frederick Rice, spotted the German submarine U-64 lying in ambush at the mouth of the Herjungsfjord near Bjerkvik. Diving from an altitude of 200 feet, the antiquated biplane dropped 200-pound anti-submarine bombs, scoring a direct hit just behind the submarine's conning tower. The U-64's hull was ripped open in the sea, and she sank rapidly to the bottom of the fjord, killing 8 crewmen. It was a historic aviation milestone, the first time in World War II that a submarine was sunk by an aircraft. More importantly for Whitworth, it eliminated the only underwater threat that could have critically wounded his Leviathan. With the path cleared, Warspit entered the main basin. What followed was less a battle and more a systematic execution. The surviving German destroyers desperately attempted to ambush the incoming British line, weaving through deployed smokescreens and utilizing the narrow geography of the fjord to mask their movements. But Warspit's massive 15-inch guns simply fired through the smoke and over the intervening mountain ridges. The sheer concussion of the battleship's main armament was apocalyptic. The thunderous shockwaves reverberated against the sheer cliff faces, physically shaking the snow off the surrounding mountains. Winston Churchill later described the reverberations as sounding, quote, like the voice of doom. The German destroyer Erich Kullner, which had been severely damaged on rocks days prior and was positioned at Tarstadt to act as a static floating battery, was spotted by the Swordfish and rapidly targeted. She was pulverized by a merciless barrage of 15-inch shells from Warspit and torpedoes from the escorting destroyers, sinking with heavy loss of life. Back at the Narvik docks, Dieter von Roeder and Erich Giese, both immobilized by severe engine failure, fought a bitter last stand. They managed to damage the British destroyers Punjabi and Cossack with their remaining ammunition before being ripped apart by British steel and sinking into the harbor. Commander Bay's remaining operational vessels, Zenker, Arnhem, Ludeman, Tila, and Kuna, realized that surface combat against a super dreadnought was entirely futile. Out of ammunition and running their engines on fumes, they turned and fled eastward, deeper into the trap. The surviving German destroyers fled into the Rombaksfjord, a narrow dead-end sidearm of the main fjord that offered absolutely no route of escape. HMS Eskimo relentlessly pursued the Heimann Kuna into the shallow bay of Trollvika, where the German crew, having exhausted their ammunition, abandoned the ship and detonated scuttling charges. just as British torpedoes slammed into the hull, obliterating the vessel. Eskimo continued the pursuit deeper into the Narrows, but was suddenly ambushed at point-blank range by Georg Thiel and Hans Ludemann. In a synchronized assault, the Germans fired their last remaining torpedoes, scoring a devastating hit that entirely severed Eskimo's bow, though the British ship miraculously survived. Despite this final act of defiance, the German tactical situation was entirely hopeless. Trapped against the sheer rock walls of the Rombaksfjord with nowhere left to run, the crews of the Wolfgang Zenker, Bernd von Arnim, and Hans Ludemann intentionally ran their vessels hard aground. To prevent capture by the encroaching British forces, the crews opened the seacocks, smashed their sensitive optical and fire control equipment, and blew up their own ships using depth charges. The naval battle of Narvik was conclusively over. In just 4 days, the Kriegsmarine had lost 10 modern destroyers, nearly 50% of its entire surface destroyer force, a catastrophic strategic blow that permanently crippled the German surface fleet's ability to contest the open ocean. Yet, this absolute naval annihilation gave birth to a remarkable strategic irony. From the burning wrecks of the 10 destroyers and the sunken U-64, between 21 and 2,600 German sailors survived the freezing waters and swam ashore. Cold, shivering, and devoid of heavy equipment, naval doctrine dictated they should have been quickly rounded up as prisoners of war. However, General Edward Dietl, desperately short of infantry to hold the town, immediately absorbed the survivors into his ranks. Dietl marched the shipwrecked sailors to the nearby Norwegian Army mobilization depot at Elva Guardsman, which had been captured intact during the initial invasion on April 9th. Inside the depot, the Germans discovered a logistical treasure trove, winter clothing, rations, 315 machine guns, and over 8,000 Krag-Jørgensen bolt-action rifles meant for the Norwegian army. The Krag-Jørgensen, notable for its distinct side-loading magazine and smooth bolt operation, was an ideal weapon for the environment. The shipwrecked sailors swapped their wet naval uniforms for field gear, slung the Norwegian rifles over their shoulders, and were transformed into an improvised infantry unit, officially designated the Naval Mountain Infantry. This hybrid force of stranded sailors and elite mountain troops entrenched themselves in the unforgiving snow-swept mountains surrounding the fjord, manning salvaged anti-aircraft guns stripped from the sunken destroyers. Defying all military logic, these men, who had lost their entire fleet and were fighting as infantry for the first time, held the high ground around Narvik against a combined allied force of Norwegian, British, French, and Polish troops for the next 2 months. Though the Royal Navy had won absolute supremacy on the water and inflicted a devastating blow to the Kriegsmarine, the tactical adaptability of the German survivors ensured that the iron prize of Narvik would ultimately remain firmly in the grip of the Third Reich.